Hello, and welcome to Great Works. I'm your host, Jeff Fraser. Today we consider the question, why study great literature? I think there are many answers to that question. I'm here to suggest just a few of them. I am going to focus on two major themes that recur over and over again in great literature: the problem of evil and the meaning of suffering. They relate to real life today just as they always have. All you have to do is look at the news.
Mass shootings, hate crimes, racial injustice, social turmoil, climate change, hurricanes, war in the Middle East, and now a frightful pandemic. But as bad as things may be, this is not the human race's first rodeo. Let's see how great writers have grappled with the problem of evil and suffering over the centuries. Here are the works that I want to discuss. The lives of the authors span 4 centuries. Take a moment to consider how much the world has changed in that time. Yet the themes remain timeless.
We begin our discussion with Hamlet. Let's briefly review the plot. Hamlet comes home from college to find that his father, the king, is dead. His mother has already remarried to his uncle Claudius. Hamlet sees a ghost who claims to be his father. The ghost tells Hamlet that he was murdered by Claudius and urges Hamlet to take revenge. And that's just Act 1. Hamlet spends the rest of the play trying to decide what to do next.
So, Hamlet is directly confronted with the problem of evil. Just what is the proper response in a situation as dreadful as this? Revenge? Hamlet is deeply conflicted, and I think Shakespeare wants us to remember that taking another person's life is not an easy thing to do, at least for most of us. This is not some simple-minded Hollywood revenge movie. Besides, killing Claudius won't bring his father back or repair his relationship with his mother. Hamlet is kind of stuck. He lapses into a state of despair. He contemplates suicide. On the one hand, suicide would put an end to his current suffering, but on the other hand, as he says, the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. And there is plenty of suffering to go around. Ophelia is convinced that Hamlet's feigned madness is real, and then learns that her father has been killed. She goes mad herself. She drowns, perhaps by accident, or perhaps by suicide. Ultimately, Hamlet does take action, and Claudius is killed. But so is Hamlet, along with Laertes, Gertrude, Polonius, and Ophelia. It is not a very happy ending. Let's look at the historical context here. Consider the year 1586, 14 years before the first performance of Hamlet. Elizabeth I, a Protestant, is Queen of England. Her cousin, Mary Stuart, deposed Queen of Scotland, is Catholic. The Catholics believe that Mary is the rightful heir to the throne of England. Mary conspires with a group of Catholics in a plot to assassinate Elizabeth and to declare herself Queen of England. English officials loyal to Elizabeth discover the plot. Mary is convicted of treason and beheaded. Consider also another of Shakespeare's great tragedies, Macbeth. Macbeth murders King Duncan of Scotland and steals the crown. But, bad news for him, he is plagued by guilt, descends into madness, and ultimately loses the kingdom and his life. Macduff, a nobleman loyal to the family of King Duncan, defeats Macbeth in a great battle and chops off his head. So, killing a queen or a king is a risky venture. You may wind up losing your mind and your head. Many critics have argued that Hamlet's tragic flaw is that he thinks too much, that he is too indecisive. I never understood his careful approach as a flaw. Do we want a hero who impulsively and immediately kills Claudius without considering the possible consequences? I think Shakespeare wants to emphasize that one's response to evil is a complex question, especially if one has a conscience. Thus, Hamlet is torn between revenge and despair. Is there a third option? Could Hamlet, for example, have Claudius arrested? No. There is no police force, there is no court system. Hamlet is all alone. Could he perhaps forgive Claudius? No, that would not be realistic. We will circle back to this idea of forgiveness, but it does not seem to be a viable option here. What does Hamlet tell Ophelia to do? Get thee to a nunnery. Joining a convent or a monastery is one way to escape the evils of the world. Buddhist monks, for example, will sequester themselves in monasteries with this explicit purpose in mind.
Let's leave Hamlet for now and skip ahead all the way to Slaughterhouse-Five. I chose to move Slaughterhouse-Five out of chronological order and put it here right before Candide, because in my mind there are so many parallels between the two works. They are both satires filled with dark humor, and each tells the story of a naive, unsophisticated, and unassuming hero who is bruised and battered by the forces of evil, or of fate, depending on your way of looking at things, until finally the protagonist achieves a form of enlightenment or wisdom. In addition, Vonnegut was a great admirer of Voltaire.
Billy Pilgrim is a chaplain in the U.S. Army during World War II and is captured by the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge. During their time in captivity, both Vonnegut and Billy Pilgrim witnessed the horrors of war, including the firebombing that devastated the beautiful German city of Dresden. The scenes of death and destruction are shockingly tragic and deeply disturbing. The question raised is this: was the firebombing necessary to defeat Hitler, or was it partly to avenge the Germans' prolonged bombing of London earlier in the war? 3 years after the war, Billy suffers a nervous breakdown, and he admits himself to a mental hospital because he thinks he is going crazy. Vonnegut tells us his doctors agreed. He was going crazy. Clearly, he is suffering from what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition common among veterans of all wars, caused by the unimaginable, unthinkable horrors that they have experienced. In a seemingly irrelevant interlude, Billy becomes acquainted with another patient who tells Billy about the merits of science fiction literature. Then, out of nowhere, he tells Billy something very interesting, that everything there is to know about life is in the Brothers Karamazov. Slaughterhouse-Five is very much an anti-war novel. Its greatness stems from Vonnegut's skill as a storyteller, combining an unflinching portrayal of the horrors of war with the fantasies of science fiction. and from his ability to help the reader see the tragedy, the absurdity, and the dark humor of war all at the same time. In addition, Vonnegut's compassion for the victims of war shines through above all else. 23 years after the war, around the time memories of Dresden start to haunt him again, Billy is captured by the Tralfamadorians. They teach him that they can see in 4 dimensions, not just 3. The 4th dimension is time, and time is not a series of moments that come and go. Each moment is there forever. You can experience any particular moment whenever you want, just as, when looking at a range of mountains, you can focus on any particular peak that you want to. It's as if everything that happens in your life is carved in stone from the very beginning. The problem you earthlings have, they say, is like this. Imagine you are strapped onto the seat of an open railway trolley so that you can't move. Your head is encased in a metal helmet so that you can only see straight ahead through a long metal tube. You can only see a tiny, tiny part of your life at any one time. Meanwhile, the railway car can move forward or back, slow or fast, up hills or down, and you have absolutely no control over where you are going or what you are able to see. The most important thing I learned on Tralfamadore was that when a person dies, he only appears to die. He is still very much alive in the past, so it is very silly for people to cry at his funeral. All moments, past, present, and future, always have existed, always will exist. When a Tralfamadorian sees a corpse, all he thinks is that the dead person is in a bad condition in that particular moment, but that the same person is just fine in plenty of other moments. What is fascinating to me is that many physicists, including Einstein, have said virtually the same thing. In 1955, when his lifelong friend Michel Besso died, he wrote, "Now he has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me. That means nothing. People like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." When Billy gets back to Earth and tries to tell the world about his experiences on Tralfamadore, of course, everyone believes he has gone completely mad. Perhaps he has. But even so, perhaps there is nevertheless some wisdom to be found in his madness. We find here the theme of fatalism. War is inevitable. Suffering is inevitable. It's all part of the deal. Might as well try to be cheerful. Vonnegut is perhaps suggesting that we take every opportunity to remember life's nicer moments and to accept the bad moments with a hefty dose of dark humor. Let's turn now to Candide and take a moment to remind ourselves of the main characters. Candide is said to be honest, trusting, pure of heart, and unable to tell a lie. Princess Cunegonde is Candide's love interest, and Professor Pangloss is the philosopher with the unshakable belief that this must be the best of all possible worlds. The book is a travelogue of human misery, suffering, evil, and tragedy. Everywhere they go, our main characters witness mass killings, rape, torture, natural disasters, and plague. But here is the twist. The book is meant to be humorous. And it is. It is a satire, and Voltaire is suggesting that evil and suffering are everywhere. But he is poking fun at the idea that suffering and evil are part of some grand design. Instead, he implies that suffering is due to people's own foolishness, superstition, greed, hatred, pride, jealousies, or, in other cases, just plain bad luck. Like all successful satires, it is based on true events, but the story itself is so fantastical, implausible, and ironic that you find yourself amused instead of saddened. Through satire, both Vonnegut and Voltaire are able to create some emotional distance from all the suffering, in order to ease the pain, if only momentarily. Here is one example. At one point, Candide and Pangloss arrive in Portugal after almost drowning at sea, at the time of the famous Lisbon earthquake. Voltaire tells us, after the earthquake had wiped out 3/4 of Lisbon, the learned men of the land could find no more effective way of averting total destruction than to give the people a fine auto da fe. So, heretics are accordingly rounded up. When spies overhear Pangloss yet again explaining his philosophy to Candide, they find his views inconsistent with Catholic teachings and report him to the Grand Inquisitor, who agrees they must be heretics. Candide and Pangloss are made to dress up in ridiculous costumes. Wearing these costumes, they marched in a procession and listened to a very touching sermon, followed by a beautiful concert of plainsong. Voltaire goes on, Candide was flogged in cadence to the music, the Jews were burned, and Pangloss was hanged, though hanging is not customary. On the same day there was another earthquake causing frightful damage. Candide, stunned, stupefied, despairing, bleeding, trembling, said to himself, if this is the best of all possible worlds, what are the others like? So this is the running joke. Whenever things are going badly, Candide expresses a growing doubt regarding Pangloss's teachings. In the end, all three main characters and a few other secondary characters, including another traveling philosopher named Martin, are reunited in Turkey, where they live on a small communal farm and all are finally safe. After the encounter with the Turkish farmer and his daughters, the small group is inspired to embrace the simple life of farming. Martin decides to give up philosophy. Let us work without speculating, he says. It's the only way to make life bearable. But Pangloss can't quite let go of his old philosophy. He says to Candide, all events are linked together in the best of all possible worlds. For after all, if you hadn't gone through all of these years of terrible trials and tragedies, then you wouldn't be here enjoying candied citrus fruits and pistachios. That is very well put, said Candide, but we must cultivate our garden. With these final words of Candide's, let us leave Turkey and travel to 19th century Russia, where we find Dostoevsky writing his masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov. This is a long and complex novel, and there is no way to do it full justice in this presentation. So I am just going to focus on the Grand Inquisitor episode. As you recall from my written introduction, Jesus comes down to earth during the Spanish Inquisition, and the Grand Inquisitor has him imprisoned and sentenced to death. During their discussion in Jesus' prison cell, the Grand Inquisitor gives an extensive defense of the Inquisition and the need to root out heretical views and practices so as to make sure that people's beliefs conform to church doctrine. The Grand Inquisitor persists in arguing that it is necessary to take away people's freedom, specifically their freedom of thought, in order to allow them lasting happiness during their lifetime. And the Grand Inquisitor is willing to take on the responsibility for committing this grand deception on behalf of the common people. Now here's the best part. Jesus has been silent the entire time, and when the Grand Inquisitor finally finishes his defense, he is just a bit afraid of how Jesus might respond. However, Jesus says nothing, but simply kisses the old man gently on the lips. The Grand Inquisitor is startled. Then, after a moment, he opens the cell door, letting Jesus escape, while telling him to go and never come back. During Ivan's recounting of his poem, Alyosha becomes increasingly agitated. Finally, he interrupts Ivan and protests that the poem is not a fair portrayal of either Jesus or of the Catholic Church. In truth, Ivan's poem is clearly meant as a criticism of organized religion, but then Jesus' kiss at the end is ambiguous. Is Jesus forgiving the Grand Inquisitor? Realizing that Alyosha is upset, Ivan asks if his brother is offended by the poem. Alyosha quietly kisses Ivan on the lips. Greatly relieved, Ivan says, "That's plagiarism. Thank you, though."
To me, the Grand Inquisitor is ultimately a parable about forgiveness and mutual respect. This is not to say that forgiving someone is always possible, but Alyosha and Ivan are able to maintain an affectionate, brotherly relationship only because each is willing to respect the other's point of view.
After all, was not forgiveness central to Jesus' ministry? In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus, after reminding the people of the commandment to love their neighbors, goes on to say, "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." I can't leave this masterwork without mentioning that elsewhere in the book, as a counterpoint to Jesus' appearance in Ivan's little poem, Ivan, now delirious from a high fever, has a conversation with the devil. A conversation which will make your head spin, and which is another fascinating display of Dostoevsky's imaginative genius. Finally, we come to Camus' The Plague. I can honestly tell you that I had planned to include the plague in my presentation long before we were hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. As things turned out, this book surpasses all the others in its immediate relevance to our world today. Let me remind you, as I mentioned in my introduction, that Dr. Rieu's dedication to his patients and to the duties of his profession never wavers. He simply accepts his role as a given, despite the hopelessness of the situation. Like Voltaire in Candide and Vonnegut in Slaughterhouse-Five, Camus conveys a strong sense of fatalism, of the relative powerlessness of humans to change their destiny in the face of natural forces. Finally, after many months and thousands of deaths, the plague runs its course and comes to an end. The town celebrates. But Camus won't let the story end without one more note of fatalism, acceptance, and compassion from Dr. Rieu. Nonetheless, he knew that the tale he had to tell could not be one of a final victory. It could be only the record of what had to be done, and what assuredly would have to be done again in the never-ending fight against terror and its relentless onslaughts, by all who, despite their personal afflictions and while unable to be saints, refuse to bow down to pestilences and strive their utmost to be healers. Do you see now why I wanted you also to be aware of Camus' essay, The Myth of Sisyphus? Do you see any parallels between the character of Dr. Rieu and Camus' Sisyphus? Perhaps we can see in both an unquestioning acceptance of one's fate and a steadfast, uncomplaining devotion to one's assigned role in the world. Candide and his companions also find contentment in accepting their simple life as their destiny and taking what pleasure they can in mundane manual labor as they tend to their farm day in and day out. Let's take a moment and review where we have been. We understand how evil and suffering can lead to depression, despair, and even suicide. Remember Hamlet's state of mind in his To Be or Not to Be speech, and then consider this famous quote from Camus. There is only one serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. But let's remember how these authors suggest some alternative end results. An attitude of fatalism can lead not to despair, but to acceptance and contentment. Suffering can teach one empathy and compassion, and ultimately perhaps a sense of purpose. Forgiveness, mutual respect, and tolerance can lead to peace of mind and greater harmony within a community. Remember the Serenity Prayer and its simple wisdom.
Let me finish by talking about empathy in action, not in literature, but in real life. I'm going to tell you the story of the Cajun Navy. As you may know, Louisiana is home to the Cajun culture and to the people who call themselves Cajuns.
In 2005, Hurricane Katrina devastated Louisiana and the city of New Orleans. It was one of the deadliest hurricanes ever. People were stranded for days by the flooding. 12 years later, Hurricane Harvey came crashing into Houston. What did people of Louisiana do? Well, some of them formed the so-called Cajun Navy. They hitched their boats to their pickup trucks and drove to Houston to help rescue the victims of Hurricane Harvey. As a neurologist, I was very interested to learn that neuroscientists are very familiar with this phenomenon. Simply put, people who have experienced a tragedy tend later on to be more willing to help victims of a similar tragedy. Jamil Zaki is a professor of psychology at Stanford University and the director of the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab. Using tools from psychology and neuroscience, he and his colleagues examine how empathy works and how people can learn to empathize more effectively. For example, neuroscientists have shown experimentally that subjects who witness suffering in a virtual reality environment demonstrate greater empathy for victims of tragedy in follow-up testing. Professor Zaki has written a book entitled The War for Kindness: Building Empathy in a Fractured World. In the book, one of his many claims is that reading literature enhances empathy. He writes, "There are several robust experimental studies in support of this claim." Then there's this fellow, Maurice Hamington, professor of philosophy at Portland State University, whose special interest is in the field of care ethics. He also happens to be a very good friend of mine, going back to our days in high school together. Not too long ago, he and a co-author published a book called Care Ethics and Poetry. It is based on the same premise, in this case that a careful reading of selected poems can increase one's capacity for compassion and empathy. Perhaps these ideas we have discussed here can shed new light on the virtues we strive to develop in ourselves.
So here's my advice. Read great works. Understand the historical context and consider how the themes relate to your world and to your experiences. Guaranteed, you'll be a richer person for it.
Let me finish with two other pieces of advice from Vonnegut and Voltaire. A reasonable purpose for a human being is to help someone else get through this thing, whatever it is. Kurt Vonnegut. Let us cultivate our garden. Voltaire.